Well, so we are going to be doing this little series on I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And it's based on the book by Drs. Norman Geisler and Frank Turek. And in this presentation, it's basically going to answer four questions. One, does truth exist? Secondly, does God exist? Three, are miracles possible? Four, is the New Testament true? Now, for our purposes, we're only going to be pretty much going over, does truth exist and does God exist? And so, I guess we should probably start by explaining maybe what apologetics is. I'm sure you guys have all heard the term apologetics before, and it comes from the Greek word apologia, and what it means is to give a defense, And so, several times in Scripture we're commanded to, like 1 Peter 3:15, that's the apologist's favorite verse, be ready always to give an answer to everyone who asks for a reason of the hope that's within you with meekness and fear. And 2 Corinthians 10:5 tells us to demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. So apologetics is just defending the Christian worldview. And some people might think, well, why would we need to defend the Christian worldview? And the answer, it's pretty obvious. Frank Turek, who runs the Cross-Examine website and the Cross-Examine ministry, they've done a lot of research, and you can look at Barna polls and other stats, and what you'll see is that 75% of Christian kids who grow up in a Christian home, when they go to college, first year they go to college, they end up walking away from Christianity. And almost always it is because of intellectual doubts, right? Because the church is really not addressing a lot of these issues. So the kid goes to Sunday school every week and they hear, Jonah and the whale, Noah, David and Goliath, these type of things. And then they go off to college and they get in with some rabid atheist New Testament professor like Bart Ehrman at Chapel Hill, and he starts saying things like, the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they really didn't write the Gospels. The Gospels were written centuries, after the events happened. Or other professors will say things like Jesus never even really existed. Or they go into their science class and they're being taught naturalism, that the universe and everything, its properties, the world, stars, life, everything is basically a process of natural processes. And so the student comes back and, they talk to their parents and they're not given real answers. What they're told is, well, you just need to trust in Jesus, you just need to have faith, but they're never really given good answers of why they should believe what it is that they are told to believe. And I don't just say this kind of as someone sitting back in a chair, although I am sitting back in a chair, kind of doing armchair philosophy. It happened to me. I grew up in a Christian home. My father was a pastor, and very good parents. I'm not trying to disparage them at all. But one of the issues I had was creation versus evolution. And I was very close with my grandfather, who was an atheist. He was, born in England. He was in World War II, right around that whole era of skepticism, atheism, the ramped up attacks on the Bible. And so he was an atheist. And so we would have conversations, even as a kid. I remember talking with him. And, he just did not have good answers for why Christianity was true. And so hopefully what we'll seek to do in this presentation is lay a couple good foundations. One, we're going to look at, does truth exist? Because that's the foundation of everything else, right? If truth does not exist, then the question of does God exist, becomes meaningless. If there's no such thing as truth, or if truth can't be known, or if truth about God cannot be known, then the question of does God exist just becomes unimportant. So the first thing we need to do is establish, does truth exist? And what better place to start with does truth exist than Jack Nicholson, You Good Men. You remember the discussion going on with Tom Cruise and Jack Nicholson, and he's playing the lawyer, and he's asking him, what is the truth? And he screams out, you can't handle the truth, right? But first we have to really ask the question, what is truth? Right? We hear, about truth claims all the time, but ultimately, what is truth? And can we know the truth? And can we know truths about God? Right? So we'll start by saying truth is telling it like it is. If I said that I right now am standing in Missouri in the middle of a cornfield, that would not be telling it like it is, right? Because obviously I'm not doing that. Truth is telling it like it is, or truth is that which corresponds to reality. So sometimes people, they get mixed up and they think, well, truth is whatever works. No, truth is not whatever works. Truth is telling it like it is. Truth is that which corresponds to reality. One of the first things we're going to look at as we go over truth is the law of non-contradiction. And this helps us kind of discover what is false. So we're going to start with the laws of logic. These are the first principles of thinking. And the law of non-contradiction helps us because it exposes false ideas. And what it tells us is opposite ideas cannot be both true and false at the same time in the same sense. So this last, 2 weeks ago, we went to the pagan festival. And some people think I'm being mean when I say that, but they call themselves pagans. It was called the pagan festival. And they were pantheists, right? So, and we'll look at that when we get into the existence of God as far as the different worldviews. But basically, they believe reality is an illusion. And they would say things like, all paths lead to God. Right? We would say, well, what do you think about Christianity? Well, that's a good religion. Jesus was a fine teacher. He was a good man. What do you think about Islam? Oh, we like Islam too. Right? All these paths supposedly lead to God. But what's the problem with that? It sounds good. It sounds good in our culture and with, the kind of politically correct climate we live in. But the problem is opposites cannot, two claims that are stating opposite propositions cannot both be true. For example, and I would use this on them and I would just get this blank stare back. Christianity says Jesus Christ is God the Son. Jesus Christ is God the Son. Islam says God has no son. So I ask you, can both be true? Can both be true? Could both be false? Yeah, both could be false. Maybe Jesus isn't who he claimed to be. Maybe Christianity is false. That's logically possible. We're going to demonstrate, I think, that that's not the case. But it's at least possible that both are false. But they both cannot be true because they're making opposite truth claims. Oxford professor John Lennox, nice guy. Got the chance to meet him last year at the Apologetics conference. I was starstruck. This guy is an Oxford professor, teaches, I think, mathematics. He wrote several books, great defender of the Christian faith. Wrote the book, Has Science Buried, no, it's God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God? Very intelligent man. I think at least 2 PhDs. He argues God does exist. He says God does exist. Oxford professor Richard Dawkins. How many of you guys have heard of Richard Dawkins before? Yeah? Very ardent atheist, very anti-theist, has wrote several books. Probably one of those ones that really took him to fame was The Blind Watchmaker. But one of his latest books he wrote was called God Delusion. And has anybody read the book, The God Delusion? It would be good for you guys to get the book. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. And after going through that book, pick up Richard Dawkins' book. Rent it at the library or something. That way you're not giving money to him. But he claims that Christians and people that believe in God, we're just deluded. We are deluded for believing that God exists. But as we look at the law of non-contradiction, can these both be true? Can these claims both be true? See, that is really that easy. Either God exists or God does not exist. But both claims cannot be true. And really, when you think about it, either possibility is frightening. Because if God exists, what does that mean? That means my life's not my own. That means I might be held accountable for what I believe, how I live. But if God does not exist, I think that is also equally as frightening. What happens to people like Hitler? What happens to people like Pol Pot? What happens to these people that do great, horrendous evil and at the end of the day just turn into worm food? Right? No ultimate meaning, no ultimate purpose, no ultimate justice. And if it's true, if God does not exist, like Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, if the resurrection is not true, eat, drink, be merry. Why? Because tomorrow we die. So both cannot be true. And the law of non-contradiction helps us with that. He's right. Law of non-contradiction is undeniable. Even those who deny it, they have to use it. If they're saying the law of non-contradiction does not exist, they're having to employ the law of non-contradiction to make that claim. So it's one of these principles you simply can't get around. In order to deny it, you have to use it. The great medieval philosopher Avicenna says, anyone who denies the law of non-contradiction should be beaten and burned until he admits that to be beaten is not the same as not to be beaten, and to be burned is not the same as not to be burned. I think maybe that method would help today sometimes in the college classroom. So some things about truth that we need to shore up is something that is true for all persons at all times and all places. All truth is absolute. Now, some people are going to challenge this. They might say, for example, Whitney, she feels cold. She's got her little sweater on. Whitney feels cold. Billy's got his t-shirt on, and Billy feels hot. So how could it be true when Whitney is cold and Billy is hot? Well, it would be absolutely true for all people at all times and all places that Whitney feels cold. And it would be absolutely true for all persons, all times and all places that Billy feels hot. So truth is absolute. I didn't say he looked hot. I said he was hot. And this goes for all persons at all times in all places. Some of the objections to absolute truth. You're going to get this a lot. There is no truth. How many of you guys have heard that? If you go onto the college campus, you're going to get that all the time. There's no such thing as truth. Or how about, you can't know the truth. All truth is relative. Man, when we were at that pagan festival, it was over and over and over. These were the type of claims that were being presented. Or, it's true for you, but not for me. Or, no one has the truth. And my favorite, you ought not judge. How many times do you get, you ought not judge? This is a conversation stopper, so the skeptic thinks. As soon as you pull this out, then argument over, conversation over. So I'm going to show you guys an amazing, incredible tool in how to answer these objections, right? This is called the Roadrunner tactic. And this is, what you do is apply the claim to itself. I'm going to show you how this works. And once you guys master this, you guys are going to look like super geniuses. Because you're going to be able to see through a lot of the philosophical smoke where they really think that they are sounding like they are really saying something wise and profound, when ultimately it really just collapses in on itself. So let's look at a couple examples. If someone were to say, I can't speak a word in English. And if they just said that in English, what would we say? Did he just say that in English? It's a self-refuting statement. If you say, I can't speak a word in English, and then you say that in English, the claim absolutely falls in on itself. You guys, I'm sure, remember growing up watching Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner, and that coyote is always after the Roadrunner, and he would stop, perfect, going 100 miles an hour, and the coyote would sail off the cliff, and then he'd look and he'd notice there was no ground underneath him. This is the look you get from people when you employ the Roadrunner tactic. It's that same look. Because the person making the claim has no ground to stand on. What about the claim there is no truth. This is the interactive part of the program. What would you guys say to this? Someone says there is no truth. What do you say?
Is that true?
Is that true? Is that true? You've seen the slides. You've seen the slides. Genius. Super genius. Or there is no such thing as absolute truth. What do you say? Liz, what do you say?
Are you absolutely sure that's true?
Are you absolutely sure that is true? Very good. It's true for you, but not for me. True for you, but not for me. What do we say to that? Is that true for everybody? Right? And that's true for you, but not for me. That would apply to everybody. There's no truth in anything but science. I run into this a lot. Actually, I was in a discussion with two atheists about 2 weeks ago. This view is an old philosophical view called logical positivism, and it was kind of really put forth by A.J. Ayer, and it's actually fallen out of philosophical circles because it is self-refuting. And this really is the culture today that we live in. If you can't test it by science, if I can't taste, touch, all this, through the scientific method, then we can't know if it is true. But the problem is this: if someone says there's no truth in anything but science, is that a scientific claim? Right? They're stating a supposed truth that I can't run that claim through the scientific method. So if that claim is true, that there's no truth in anything but science, then the view collapses in on itself. So as you see, that's a real problem. So you have here Immanuel Kant, who was a very influential philosopher, who basically said, because of our senses, we cannot know the real world. And you hear this all the time. You can't know the real world. This is what the pantheists were saying to us. But then you ask the question, how do you know that about the real world? Right? You have to know something about the real world in order to make that claim. What would you have to know? Well, that you can't know it. But you would have to know something about it in order to make that claim. My wife always has these crazy dreams, and she'll wake up the next morning and tell me about these dreams. And you would think they were like real adventures if you listen to them. My dreams never make sense, I'm chasing Easter rabbits or something like that. She has these dreams where things make sense. But how does she know that it's a dream and not reality? Because she's able to wake up and she's being able to see reality from the dream. In order to know that this life that we're living is not an illusion, you'd have to be outside of the illusion to know that, wouldn't you? And in order to know that you can't know the real world, you'd have to know something about the world. And the claim is that it can't be known. How about this claim? You should doubt everything. Right? You should doubt everything. Should I doubt that? Right? If you apply the radical skepticism that so many of the atheists employ, really to their own worldview, if Richard Dawkins was half as critical about the neo-Darwinian theory of evolution as he is about Christianity, then he'd be writing the atheist delusion, I think, instead, because there's a host of things that one has to believe without very good reasons to think that is the case. How about this one? You ought not judge. You guys help me out with that. What do you say to that? Someone says, you ought not judge.
Stop judging.
Isn't that a judgment? Right? They're saying you should not judge, but to say you should not judge, you're making a judgment that it's wrong to judge. This is mental constipation, I know. It can get you, take a few seconds to get this. I understand that. It's a good tactic to turn around and use on these type of little pithy cliches, because they may sound intelligent. When you apply the claim to itself, it absolutely fails. Let's keep moving on here. So let's look at a few of the things about truth. The truth about truth. Contrary beliefs are possible, but contrary truths are not possible. Contrary beliefs are possible, but contrary truths are not possible. So what do I mean by that? As we were discussing with several of the people at the pagan parade, they would say, for example, things like, well, people who used to think the earth was flat, that was true for them. Even though that the world is round, well, it's true for us that the world is not now round. But that's false. It's objectively true that the earth has always been round, not flat. So people can have different views about things. People can think that the moon is made of green cheese, or that man never really landed on the moon, or all kind of crazy things. Contrary beliefs are possible, but contrary truths are not possible. Why? Because truth is that which corresponds to reality, and we cannot change that truth. You've heard the saying, you're entitled to your own opinion, but not your own facts, right? Because facts are just that, they're immutable, unchanging. Secondly, you can believe everything is true, but everything can't be true. You can believe that all roads lead to God. You can believe that Islam and Christianity are both, the same thing, but they can't both be true, as shown because it just violates the basic laws of logic. 3, objective truth can't be denied without being affirmed. What do we mean by that? And let me maybe talk a little bit about the difference between subjective and objective. So when I say objective, an objective truth would be, for example, 2 plus 2 is 4, right? That's just not my opinion. That is the object. 2 plus 2 is 4. A subjective truth might be something like, if I said Rocky Road ice cream is the best ice cream in the world, right? I might think it's objective, but it's not. It's subjective. I'm saying something about me. I like Rocky Road ice cream, but it doesn't say anything about ice cream itself. I'm the one that has to taste the ice cream. But an objective truth would be, the ice cream is such and such degrees, it weighs such and such amount of weight. So there's a difference between objective truth and subjective truth. Objective truth cannot be denied without being affirmed. So it would be, again, like saying there is no such thing as truth. In order to claim there's no such thing as truth, one has to affirm that truth does indeed exist. We can take a few questions on this before we go on to the second section. I know that not sure what happened there. What timing though? Does anyone have any questions on that section? Have faith. You should believe that God created the world. You should believe that the Bible is true. But when you start really kind of digging into, well, why though? What do you do with things like dinosaurs? Or what do you do with things like cavemen? What do you do with some of these things that you see or that you're being taught in school, but it seems to be very contrary to what the Bible itself teaches? So the first thing I want to do is we need to demonstrate, does God exist? And then from that, we can get into some of the arguments from design, because I fully reject the theory of evolution. Of course, you have to define what you mean by evolution, because there's a lot of word play in there, right? You hear some people like Eugenie Scott runs the organization out in California. Sole purpose is to keep intelligent design out of the schools, and she'll define evolution as any type of gene frequency change, which, who's going to deny that? What we're talking about is parent to professor, or sometimes called macro evolution, and we'll look at that into a little greater depth. But the question of whether or not God exists is foundational, because it answers those questions of who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going when we die? Let's see if I can get down to here. Established, does truth exist? And now that we've established truth exists and we have a good foundation under us, let's go to whether or not God exists. First thing we're going to look at is a theistic God. And what do we mean by theistic God? Well, there's different categories or subsets that could fall under a theistic God, but basically a theistic God is a God that exists outside of space, time, and matter. Let's look at these three illustrations. You have theism. This consists of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. If you notice the picture, you have the hands outside of the world, kind of holding the world up. And this is to kind of convey that God is outside, above, beyond the creation, yet still immanent and working within the creation. So this is theism. And again, that would be Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Second one is pantheism. This is the view that God is all. Not that God made all, that God is all. And in this you have Zen Buddhism, Hinduism, and the New Age movement. And this also, we dealt with at the Pagan Festival. This was the dominant worldview. And if you look at the illustration there, you see the hand or the fist inside the globe. And this is the view that God is all. God is in the pew. God is in the grass. God permeates everything. And we are God as well. And we just become one. This view philosophically goes back to what's known as monism. Then you have atheism, or religious humanism. This is a view, no God at all. You see, there's no hand there. There's nothing inside or outside of the box. It's just the laws of nature. As Carl Sagan said, the cosmos is all there is, all there was, and all there ever will be. So this view denies that there is a God at all. And it will have to answer the question of origins as far as the universe, saying either that the universe is eternal or that the universe popped into existence out of nothing, literally a finite time amount ago. So let's look at three arguments for a theistic God. Now sometimes Christians are surprised you can actually give good, rational reasons and arguments for the existence of God. But, clear up till probably the 19th century, the greatest thinkers of our time, even today, but even going back, have always been theists. Some of the most brilliant philosophers, Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine, Anselm, Jonathan Edwards, John Calvin, Martin Luther, some of these just towers of intellect. Most all your branches of modern science were started by Bible-believing Christians. Almost all of them were. So let's look at some of these arguments for the existence of God. One, we're going to look at the cosmological argument. And this is arguing from the beginning, or the origin. Where did everything come from? That's kind of the question that there's a family of different cosmological arguments. But we're going to be looking at one called the Kalam cosmological argument. Second, we're going to look at the argument from design, or sometimes called the teleological argument, the argument from design. And this is what was kind of referenced to over there is, well, how do you know God exists? Well, look at nature, look at the beauty, look at the way you have, the birds eating the nectar and the fly and the bees and the honey. And it seems like there's purpose. It seems like there's real design here, right? And then thirdly, we are going to look at the moral argument. And this one is actually pretty powerful. One of the biggest objections to Christianity, what would you guys give me a little feedback. When you guys are on the street or at your job and you're sharing your faith, what is one of the biggest objections that come up when people reject the existence of God? What do they say? What do they say?
My daughter says that life's just easier without believing in God.
Life is easier without believing in God. Okay? What are some of the other ones? What are some of the common objections that come up?
Why do you put yourself in something that doesn't exist? Or
Why do you
waste your time
with something that doesn't exist? I can tell you that the most common and the most common argument against the God of the Bible and against the existence of God, period, is the quote-unquote problem of evil. If God exists, why does the Holocaust happen? If God exists, why are there babies, thousands of babies in Africa starving to death? Right? And sometimes I think we as Christians don't feel the weight of that. And I think we need to feel the weight of that. You know, I took 2 semesters. Some people think it's just this easy answer. 2 whole semesters on this issue of the problem of evil. And I'll tell you, when you really start looking at some of the issues, man, it's a powerful argument. But you have to distinguish between what's sometimes called the logical problem and the emotional problem. The logical problem, basically what they're trying to do is argue that the existence of God and the existence of evil is logically contradictory. That's what they're trying to argue. Well, the philosopher Alvin Planting put that to bed in his book, God, Freedom, and the Problem of Evil in 1978. But you still have this emotional problem of evil. So with the morality argument, what we're going to see is that the problem of evil is actually a great argument for the existence of God. Because if you say Hitler is evil and Mother Teresa is good, what standard are you using to judge Hitler as evil? Right? It's one of those things you have to sit on God's lap to slap him in the face. So we'll get pretty good into the moral argument. So let's start with the cosmological argument, the Big Bang. Now let me say up front, because this is always a hot topic, there are several different Christian views on the age of the earth, on the account of Genesis. Some people are old earth creationists, some people are young earth creationists. I'm a young earth creationist. I believe God created the universe 6 days, about 24 hours. But there's many good, Bible-believing, godly theologians, apologists who differ with me. They would say God created, but he did it over, the age of the universe is 13.8 billion years, and the earth is 4.6 billion years old. And what they're going to say is God, he didn't do it in 24-hour times, because the word day can have different meanings. And so they're going to say this happened over billions of years. It was 6 days, but the days were not 24-hour days. So I just say that to say, and this is kind of a hot topic, but for this seminar, for this talk, I'm not trying to prove the age of the earth. I don't want to get into that. What we want to demonstrate is that the universe had a beginning. Because if the universe had a beginning, then that means the universe requires a beginner. So you can get into, after demonstrating that the universe requires a beginner, a cause, God, then you can get into some of the more finer arguments of, Noah's flood. I'm not saying those issues are not important. They are important, but they're down the road. Let's first establish God exists. Now let me say this: if you guys have any questions, feel free to raise your hand, and I don't want to keep talking if you guys have any questions about anything. Who's this guy? Well, this guy is the great physicist Stephen Hawking. In fact, he just did a few videos with the Science Channel, and came out with his new book, The Grand Design. And in this book, he really argues God does not exist. We have no need for God. God might exist, but if he does, he doesn't have a job. Out of business, because science can explain all that we see in the universe. And he was very critical in a lot of the developments on Big Bang cosmology. What he says is almost everyone now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang. Alexander Vilenkin, another well-known physicist, said this: with the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is now no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. You guys notice the language in that? You notice the language in that. What you're often told is the scientist is just a logic machine, right? No presuppositions, no bias, no commitments. But if you look at the language, you see That's not true. That is not what's going on at all. Why is the fact that the universe had a beginning, why is that a problem? Why would scientists have to run from that? See, when the Big Bang first came out, the previous theory, and there were several different models of this view, was a steady state theory, that the universe in the past was eternal. It had no beginning. It just always existed from eternity. Well, with the Big Bang, and we'll look at some of the scientific evidences for this, what it showed was that the universe had to have a beginning. And if the universe had to have a beginning, then you're going to have to explain the cause. So in a formal argument, if you were to put this in a deductive logical argument, you would say premise 1, everything that has a beginning has a cause. Everything that has a beginning has a cause. Premise 2, the universe had a beginning. Premise 2, the universe had a beginning. 3, therefore, the universe had a cause. So let's look at that first one. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. Now, when you give this argument, the atheist will always almost misstate it. And this is the objection they're going to bring. They're going to say, well, if everything needs a cause, then what caused God? In fact, I'll tell you what. Let's look at that video that I had brought up earlier.
The universe has a cause, and I take it that you would say that God caused the universe. So my question then is, if every event has a cause, what caused God?
Well, see, you just confused the statement. Everything that comes to be has a cause. God didn't come to be, so he doesn't need a cause. Just as atheists believe...
You stick to your notion.
No, I didn't. Let me finish. Just as atheists believes that the universe is eternal, often, and therefore didn't need a cause, if you can have an uncaused universe, we can have an uncaused cause. God, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander.
No, I don't know that the universe, I wouldn't say necessarily the universe is uncaused.
If it's caused, then there must have been a cause behind it.
There are causes. Now, you have the Big Bang, the hypothesis in contemporary physics and cosmology, that takes us back only to a point of what caused the matter at that time before it exploded. So that you can't stop
the Big Bang does. The Big Bang hypothesis says that the very matter of the universe came into existence 10 to 20 billion years ago. That when you take it back to a point you reach a time when you have no space, no time, and no matter, you have literally nothing.
Well, we cannot say.
Even agnostics, Robert Jastrow in his book God and the Astronomers says that it came into existence out of nothing some billions of years ago. Now, if it came to be, and every event that comes to be needs a cause, then the universe needs a cause too.
Well, I don't want to talk about the universe. You have many divergent lines of causality, many kind of events happening.
What's wrong with the universe?
You're leaping beyond it.
No, what's wrong with the universe and talking about the whole show, what Sagan calls the cosmos?
You have the cosmos, but you have many things happening in the cosmos. Physics only takes you up to a point. What happened before that point? Now, if everything has a cause,
well, that's your question. No, see,
but you make an exception to the point that everything has a cause.
It's not an exception.
You're only pushing your ignorance one back.
Oh, no, it isn't. You're missing the point. You're not listening to it. Everything that comes to be has a cause. That's the principle. The universe came to be, therefore the universe has a cause. Now, if God always existed, he didn't come to be. He doesn't need a cause.
I see. Well, you're defining the situation. You're assuming your case by definition.
Not at all.
You're defining. You said, how do you know that God did not come to be? How do you know that?
We know that the universe came to be.
But how do you know that God did not come to be?
We know that everything that comes to be had a cause.
How do you know that God did not come to be?
Because everything that comes to be has a cause. And if he caused the universe to come to be, he couldn't.
By definition, you're defining. You're trying to define what you want to prove.
By the law of rationality. The law of rationality
says
not
rational. That's an
everything that
assumption.
comes. Oh, you don't believe that?
Well, how do you know it?
Okay. Let me.
It's a rational assumption.
Let's start out with a couple of things.
Irrational assumption.
Irrational assumption is that things have causes.
Wait.
All right, so you see how that goes. So what you see is that the atheist actually misstates the argument. So the first premise is everything that begins to exist has a cause. God doesn't begin to exist. See, guys, these are basically your three options. Either the universe is eternal, the universe came into being without a cause, or The third option is someone created the universe. Something outside of the universe caused the universe to come into being. So either it's eternal, it popped into existence out of nothing, and from nothing, or 3, someone or something created it. Those are your only options. And so when we say, everything that begins to exist has a cause, this is just basic, logic. You can't get an effect without a adequate cause. Nobody here right now is worried that a zebra has popped into existence and is tearing your apartment up right now, right? We know that. We know that's not a rational assumption. So it's kind of like the story they tell of the man and his son who went in the forest, and they come across a little baseball, sitting on the ground, and the son says to the dad, "Well, Dad, where did that baseball come from?" And he says, "Well, I don't know, but it's a baseball. It wasn't caused by wind, rain, and erosion. Someone must have done it." They go about 100 yards more, they see a basketball. And the kid again, "Dad, where did this basketball come from?" "Well, I don't know, but obviously not natural processes. Someone must have done it." So now they get to a ball that is about 30 feet high. Huge ball, size of a building. "Dad, where did that ball come from?" "Well, I don't know, but someone obviously made the ball." But what if you come across a ball the size of the universe? Is it rational to say it just came into being? It just popped into existence? No, not at all. You can't have something come from nothing. Nothing is no thing. Now, a lot of times what happens is the scientists are going to equivocate on the word nothing. And equivocation happens here. If I said, "Jeff, let's go to the bank," am I talking about Bank of America or a bank at the river, right? You can have one word with different meanings. So the scientist, when he says, "Oh yeah, we see subatomic particles pop into existence from nothing," well, what the scientist is defining as nothing is an energy-rich sea environment in space, and it requires time, and it's energy. So it's not nothing. When the philosopher speaks of nothing, when we say that the universe literally came into being from nothing, we mean no space, no time, no matter. And so to pull the trick, and Lawrence Krauss does this a lot in a recent debate with William Lane Craig in Australia. There's 3 different stages of nothing. You know how ridiculous that sounds. Nothing is literally nothing, no thing. So what is some of the scientific evidence that the universe had a beginning? Because this is going to be crucial for the second premise of the argument. Right? The first premise, everything comes into existence, or everything that has a beginning has a cause. That's not going to be debated that much. People are pretty much going to give that. But what about the universe came into existence? Let's look at a few lines of evidence that demonstrate the universe did indeed come into being. Here's an acronym for you guys. SURGE, S-U-R-G-E. Second law of thermodynamics. Big 50-cent word for you guys right there. Second, we're going to look at the universe is expanding. Thirdly, radiation afterglow, great galaxy seeds, and Einstein's general relativity. So let's look at the second law of thermodynamics. The universe is running down. And as it's running down, it is running out of usable energy. Scientists will tell you that eventually the universe will, what they say, die of a heat death, which is really the opposite. It's a freeze death, where there'll be no more usable energy, no more workable energy, and the universe will go into a big freeze. And so the universe is running down. We see this with supernovas, right? What is a supernova? Well, supernova is when a star explodes, or galaxies. You see them kind of coming apart as cosmologists look up into the stars and into the sky and can look through the telescopes. So I'll give you an example of how the second law of thermodynamics works. You guys, I'm sure, have all went camping in your days, and maybe went outside in your front lawn, in your tent, and if you were like me, you were scared of the dark. So you'd have your flashlight run into brand new batteries. Well, what happens when you wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning and the flashlight is still on? Well, first, your dad's going to probably yell at you, if he was like my dad, for wasting the batteries. But second, you'll notice they're not going to be as bright as it was when you first turned it on, is it? Because it's running down, right? Eventually, it dies. It's not going to run forever. Now, if you had an outside source to plug the light into, then yeah, you could keep getting light. But the universe is what we would call a closed system. There's no new energy coming into the universe. So eventually, the universe left to itself will die. Another example with the second law of thermodynamics is if I invited you to come over to my house for coffee, and you come over to my house and you come to the table and you touch the cup of coffee, and the cup of coffee is warm, not scalding hot, but it's warm, you would know that it was relatively soon that I had made that coffee, right? But what if it wasn't warm at all? What if it was cold? What if it was just room temperature? Would you know when I made that cup of coffee? It could have been an hour, it could have been 3 days, it could have been a week. You just don't know. So the fact that the universe is still hot and still has energy is good evidence that the universe is not eternal. It's not eternal. Look at the expanding universe, Edwin Hubble. So when you look through a telescope, the radio telescope, if you take a prism and you take light, you can notice that a prism can bend light, and you have the different layers of light. And what they do as they are looking at the stars, they can bend this light. And if the stars, if the universe is expanding, the light will be on the red end of the spectrum. And this is what they call, you hear sometimes they call red shift. If it was towards the blue end of the spectrum, that would mean everything is collapsing in. That would not be good. But everything is on the red end of the spectrum. And so with that and with some other tests, they're able to demonstrate that the universe is expanding. So how does that tie into the universe having a beginning? Well, think about this. Think about this. If you had a video tape of a balloon, and by the way, sometimes the language for the Big Bang is a little sloppy. It's not an explosion, it's really an expansion is what's going on. But if you were to take a balloon and you were to blow this balloon up, blow it up. Well, if you had a video camera and kind of rolled that back, you'd eventually go down to where it was at. Well, same thing with the universe. The universe started in what's called a singularity. This is according to the Big Bang model. And with this singularity, you can go back to a point of literally nothing. No space, no time, and no matter. Right? And then through this expansion, that's when you have the universe begin. So if the universe is expanding, then that is very good evidence that the universe began to exist. Because if you roll the tape back, you eventually hit a point of nothing. So you cannot be expanding for an infinite amount of time. All right, let's look at this one, the radiation afterglow. It's hard because all my notes are down there, but I'll go off the top of my head here. Robert Wilson and Arnio, let me see here. I thought I had maybe added those. Let me see. Athiest and Robert Wilson, let's see. They discovered the radiation afterglow in 1965. It was in the Bell Laboratories in New Jersey. They actually won a Nobel Prize for this in 1978, and they found it by accident. They had their radio antennas up, and they were doing some different experiments, and they actually thought it was pigeons. They had a lot of pigeons that I guess were defecating on the building, and they thought that it was messing with their antenna, and they were getting a lot of noise and a lot of frequency. What they discovered was, with the radiation afterglow, is the heat left over from the Big Bang, or from the beginning of the universe. And they actually sent different satellites up there. They have detected this. The heat it's so faint, you're not going to be able to get a lot of this with the eye, but with different instruments that they use, they're able to pick it up and detect very slight leftover radiation from the beginning of the universe. So again, that's another strong evidence, because if the universe is infinitely old, right, then you're not going to have that. You're not going to have that at all. You're not going to be able to pick that up. It would kind of go back to the example of the cup of coffee, right? Why is it still warm? Even if it's slightly warm, you would have an idea of it had to be started sometime. It's not infinitely warm. So that's another strong discovery. The next one is the Great Galaxy Seeds. And when they sent some instruments up, I want to say it was late 80s, early 90s, what they were able to demonstrate was, and this will kind of show up in the second argument as well with the teleological argument, the precision and the fine-tuning of the expansion. If the expansion would have been faster or slower, then the universe would not have been in the condition it is in now to be able to produce these galaxies, planets, and other things that really we actually have to have for our universe even to be able to survive. They set up the, I'm going to say the Kobe satellite. I'm not sure if that is it or not. That was the, yeah, it is. Discovered by the Kobe. Vindicated on camera. Great Galaxy Seeds, discovered by the Kobe Cosmic Background Explorer satellite in 1992, and actually they won a Nobel Prize for that in 2006. I didn't have time. I've had computer issues all week, and I hadn't had time to get some of the quotes I wanted to get. But you got some of these guys like Stephen Hawking and George Smoot saying things like, this is the fingerprints of God. If you're looking at this, it is like looking at God. Not in a pantheistic sense, but it demonstrates not only that the universe had a beginning, but the amazing, incredible precision and fine-tuning that was put into the universe. Remember, if God does not exist, then what are your options? Right? You basically just have natural laws running the show. It's the laws of chemistry and physics that dictate how everything goes. So if there is no creator, then you have to explain how these incredible fine-tuning and just the incredible order. We'll see more with the anthropic principle. Yeah, scientific discovery of the century, if not at all times, says Stephen Hawking. And I'll try and get some of those quotes because they're rather amazing. And then lastly, Einstein's general relativity demonstrates that space-time and matter are commingled and dependent on each other. And all these 5 lines of evidence are going to demonstrate that the universe had a beginning, and because the universe has a beginning, therefore the universe requires a cause. So let's look at some of the scientific evidence that leads one to believe what Robert Jastrow would say was good evidence for the biblical account of creation. Now, the amazing thing about Robert Jastrow was he was an atheist. He did not believe in the existence of God. And he was the founder of NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies. This is what he says. He says, and he actually says this in his book, God and the Astronomers. Astronomical evidence leads to a biblical view of the origin of the world. The essential element in the astronomical and biblical accounts of Genesis is the same. So you have a lot of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity are all going to argue that the universe began to exist. But your other worldviews, Hinduism, Buddhism, New Age, they're going to argue for an eternal universe. And up until the Big Bang, most atheists thought that the universe was eternal as well. Astronomers now find that they have painted themselves into a corner because they have proven by their own methods that the world began abruptly in an act of creation to which you can trace the seeds of every star, every planet, every living thing, in this cosmos and on the earth, and they'll have found that all this happened as a product of forces they cannot hope to discover. That there are what I or anyone would call supernatural forces at work is now, I think, a scientifically proven fact. And again, that comes from agnostic astronomer Robert Jastrow. Nobel Prize winners on this issue say, Arno Penzias, the best data we have concerning the Big Bang are exactly what I would have predicted had I had nothing to go on with the 5 books of Moses, the Psalms, and the Bible as a whole. Again, these guys are not Bible-believing Christians. Robert Wilson, certainly there was something that set it all off. I cannot think of a better theory of the origin of the universe to match Genesis. George Smoot, there's no doubt that a parallel exists between the Big Bang as an event and the Christian notion of creation from nothing. Pass this. If the universe had a beginning, then it must have had a beginner. The evidence leads us with the following 2 options. Either, 1, no one created something out of nothing, which is the atheistic worldview. No one created something out of nothing. Or 2, someone created something out of nothing. You sometimes hear the atheists make these comments like, well, you believe God created the universe. I can't believe that because I don't believe in magic. I like to respond, yeah, what you believe in is worse than magic. Because at least in magic, you have, the magician pulling the rabbit out of the hat. If atheism is true, you don't even have the magician. So those are basically your 2 options. Either no one created something out of nothing, or someone created something out of nothing. We have to look at the evidence, and you have to go where it leads. And you have to look at something that something might be possible, but not always reasonable. It's simply not reasonable to believe that the universe is eternal. Is it logically possible? Sure, it's logically possible. Is it reasonable? No. Not with the 5 different lines of evidence that demonstrates the universe came into existence. Is it I don't think it's reasonable at all to think that the universe came into existence from nothing, without a cause. I don't see how that is possible at all. So you're left with someone created something out of nothing. This is the theistic view, which is reasonable. Good question to ask an atheist. If there is no God, why is there something rather than nothing at all? Right? I asked Billy, why are you here? Well, my parents. Why were your parents? Well, their parents. And what about their parents? Their parents, their parents, their parents. You go back infinitely, but you can't get back forever. You can't keep going and going and going. Eventually, you stop and you hit a point, and you have to ask, why is there something rather than nothing? If the universe has not always existed, then the universe is not a necessary being. The universe doesn't have to exist necessarily. So something brought the universe into being. And some people are going to say, oh, this is the God of the gaps reasoning. If I can't understand it, then therefore God must have done it, right? You hear this all the time. This is not God of the gaps, guys. Not God of the gaps at all. Why do I say that? Because I'm not arguing based on ignorance. I'm not saying that, in fact, if you listen, how many times have I brought the Bible up at all? Did I go to Genesis to prove that the universe had a beginning? No. I used the scientific evidence, right? So when people say, I'm just using the God of the gaps, it's based on what we do know, not based on what we don't know. We do know that everything that comes into being has to have a cause. We do know that the universe came into being, right? So it's not a God of the gaps. So how do atheists respond to some of this evidence? Well, a lot of them are going to point to the multiverse, self-generating universes. They were like branches from a tree trunk in a model that allows the universe to create itself. But of course, the problem with multiverse, there's no evidence for the multiverse. You can't see these, you can't test them, you can't demonstrate them, right? So if they want to be scientific and they want to take that line of approach, then what they're doing is just trying to come up with other alternate naturalistic explanations to account for our universe. But think about this. We say, oh, there's multiple universes. Well, now what have I done? Now I have to explain multiple universes, right? Without the existence of God, I can't even explain this one. I can't even explain how this one came to be. If you up the ante and just try and hide behind multiple universes, well, all you've done now is generate more of a problem. Where did all the other universes come from? So it doesn't help at all. It's sort of like we're brushing our ignorance under the rug of the very early universe, says cosmologist Chris Impey. Line from Dr. Robert Jastrow, agnostic astronomer and founder of the Goddard Institute for Space Studies, says this. I love this quote. For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he's greeted by a band of theologians who've been sitting there for centuries. Gotta love that quote, right? Well, we'll end there for tonight, if that's what you wanted to do, Jeff. People are probably getting tired, but let's do this. Let's take a few questions. I'd love to take some questions. Maybe some of the stuff I said, or if you guys maybe have come into objections or questions about whether or not God exists. Let's take some questions.